Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the cubesys panel discussion on high availability and disaster recovery in Azure Virtual Desktop deployments. Before we kick off our session today, we begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the Gadigal lands, online and offline, on which we meet today, and pay respects to our elders, past and present. And we're really happy to hosting this event from cubesys and partnering with Microsoft on this. I would like to then now introduce our senior cloud consultant at cubesys, Shahbaz Dar. Shahbaz, did you want to take over from here and get the other speakers to introduce themselves as well?
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Asta. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Welcome. Good morning. So yeah, my name is Shahbaz Dar. So I'm a senior cloud consultant at cubesys. My background is mainly in Azure Cloud, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, all that good sort of stuff. I'll introduce the panel for today. I'll start off by Lourens. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Certainly. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lourens van Dijk. I'm a partner solution architect with Microsoft, based out of Sydney, Australia. The area of focus is Azure infrastructure, so covering things like AVD, Azure VMware solution, our hybrid offerings, etc.
Thank you. And Andy.
Morning, everyone. My name's Andrew Matthews. I work alongside Shahbaz at cubesys, and very similar role, sort of working in cloud for the last almost 10 years with cubesys now, actually. So welcome, everyone. Good morning, and looking forward to this session.
Excellent. So just a couple of ground rules. Today's format it's a discussion, open discussion. It's been recorded as well, and you will get the link sent to you after the session. Please ask any questions you have. We've got like a chat window. We've got someone managing that as well. So feel free to ask questions. We've got people on hand to answer those. And as we said, the video content will be sent after the session. So a bit of an agenda, quite a bit to cover. So a bit of a topic overview around what we're going to talk about today. I think Asta mentioned it originally, but essentially it's around high availability of AVD. So we're going to talk about identity, networking, storage, compute, and some Azure services that facilitate HA. So a bit of an overview of the topic today. It's obviously talking about high availability with Azure Virtual Desktop, but to talk about that, first of all, really, we need to start from the beginning. And as Asta said to me offline, that this is literally back to the basics of AVD. It's two parts as AVD. There's two sort of cloud deployments that it kind of introduces. And one of them is infrastructure as code, which is where we have all the compute and the storage. And the other part is the platform as a service as well, which is kind of all the back-end services that we as consumers don't see. That's what Microsoft manage. So to understand HA, you really need to understand both of these areas of sort of the cloud infrastructure, because they both have a bearing on sort of the high availability and who manages that high availability. Andy, I just want to come to you first. How important is it that customers understand that sort of shared responsibility model when it comes to sort of planning HA, like DR and their sort of AVD deployments?
Yeah, obviously very important. I just popped in the chat to a link to the shared responsibility model. I'd say I'm looking at the audience, and I'm sure most of the audience are familiar with the concepts there. Obviously, I think probably worth mentioning too, before you get into any of this and any discussion about, designing for redundancy, HA, etc., having a good, clear understanding of your business requirements, RTOs, RPOs, and SLAs is, critical. There's so many. When you start looking at these PaaS and IaaS and various services, there's various sort of SKUs and different service levels and different capabilities, and if you can scope that as much as possible, it helps the journey. But yeah, the importance of it is obviously critical. We're looking at deploying from your perspective. We've obviously got the Microsoft backend AVD service, which which is all the traditional RDS components, the gateway, broker, web access. You've got the back end as well, and they're all hosted on Azure PaaS services, or presented in some cases by Azure PaaS services as well. So there's Azure Traffic Manager and Front Door on the internet facing side of the AVD service, and all the way to the back end where back end configuration data is installed on or configured or deployed on Azure SQL. So, they're using those PaaS services as well. And then for ourselves, we've got to look at those components. Obviously, the session hosts in terms of IaaS, the Azure VMs. Not just a session host though. If you've got identity, and most customers do, Active Directory and the domain controllers, we'll talk about that soon, and profile management on Azure Files, for example, applications, etc., that you've got to look after. One final thing actually is you look at that shared responsibility model, and you look at what you're responsible for, what you can control, but it's just as important to look at the other side and what Microsoft control and what are the SLAs and availability around that, to understand that. If you've got strict SLAs, maybe that determines whether you go in region or regional redundancy, that sort of thing.
And we're going to touch on a lot of these points because Microsoft do host the physical hardware, but just because they host that physical hardware doesn't mean they're responsible for what's actually, the actual configuration of that storage. So we are going to talk about a lot of those things as we move along. So one of the things that we as consumers, again, I will be referring to us all as consumers, because we all use it, right? Identity is probably the first concept that I want to talk about, because it's sort of like the new perimeter, right? Identity is the new perimeter, and there are different elements. And again, everyone's AVD might be different. Some might be native, some might be hybrid. So this is a very important dependency for Azure Virtual Desktop, and the availability of your user identity, because that's how users access it. Lourens, I just want to bring you in at this point now. So first, if we look at the various identity services, how do Microsoft, so obviously you're our Microsoft person on the call, how do Microsoft ensure that availability of some of these services? Because again, there is an aspect of, like I said, Microsoft hosts them. So how do Microsoft ensure that?
Well, if we start off there by looking at Entra ID, the red block there, that is obviously a globally distributed services that's highly available. You can almost view it as a SaaS service almost, because we, as Microsoft, we take accountability and responsibility for the whole underlying platform end to end. The two bottom ones is where it gets a bit more nuanced. So the green block, obviously, the Windows Server Active Directory domain services. That is something that you as a customer would own and would be responsible for the availability around that. But then the Entra domain services piece is really tied into the Entra ID conversation, and we give you a number of options around that to deploy that in a highly redundant fashion. I think this is your first slide, and it's a really important slide, because this decision that you make at this point for AVD redundancy and availability has got consequences further down the line. So this decision must not be made in isolation. You need to have a holistic view of what the AVD architecture is going to be, all the services you want when you make this decision, because there's lots of permutations here.
100%. And again, it could be as simple as, where are you hosting some of these services? Obviously, Entra, as you said, is a Microsoft hosted SaaS solution, essentially. But with Entra Connect, if your Entra Connect server is on premises, then there's a network element to think about, which we've got another slide on that. But it's not just identity. It integrates to potential other services as well as identity that you need to think about, redundancy of your networking and so on. Again, if you're using hybrid, where are your domain controllers physically located? If they're in Azure, then as a VM, then makes the conversation a bit easier and the thought process easier, the decision. But if it's on premises, again, that connectivity between on premises and Azure needs to be redundant as well and highly available. And there are things like express routes, and we're going to I don't want to do any spoilers. We're going to get into all that shortly. So again, identity is that first sort of perimeter, and again, it's how your users access it, which is why I kind of wanted to get it out there to start with. We've mentioned networking again. This is a very important element as well, because this is how it's all put together, right? It's how all the connectivity and how the AVD is going to integrate with the rest of your sort of ecosystem. The design implementation of your sort of network capability in Azure, especially in AVD, is very critical. And we go start talking about the whole landing zone concept as well there. Deploying that core infrastructure and making sure it's available is sort of, you've got those primary and secondary regions that you can use. Again, Lourens, I just want to bring you in again just to kind of talk about the importance of that sort of robust cloud networking topology. And again, this is probably an outside of AVD conversation, because it's about that sort of maybe hub and spoke sort of topology and how important that is to AVD and making sure it's highly available.
So from a Microsoft perspective, obviously we run multiple regions across the world. Each region consists of multiple individual data centers, either chopped up into the constructs, logic constructs, being availability zones, and so on. And within those various constructs, we have multitudes of redundant connections. If you look here in Australia East, there are multiples of factors of data centers, all connected through what we know as peering locations, or exposed to you as a customer through peering locations. And then what we do, we provide as peering locations, we got multiple of them, typically within a specific metropolitan geo area. Like here in Sydney, we have two that goes to complete different providers to get you access into the Microsoft backbone.
And Andy, I just want to bring you in quickly from a cubesys client perspective, because obviously we have a lot of customers using, and we've implemented AVD for, right? I've done a lot of these implementations. How important is that network piece, and what's some of the stuff that we've done at cubesys for our customers on that sort of network high availability, Andy?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, there's usually an on-prem environment to consider in quite a lot of our deployments. So having that virtual network gateway, that hybrid connectivity between the cloud network and on-prem is a key piece, or express route for that matter. So making sure you can have redundancy through express route circuits and paths, obviously, and with virtual private network gateways as well. But you can also deploy those services on highly available zone redundant configuration. They can be active, passive. So that's usually the core focus. I mean, obviously networks underpins everything for an AVD deployment. So I think it's probably worth mentioning in the subject of network that the DNS resolution in Azure as well, how that works. And considering however you've got your DNS configured, a lot of the time it might just be virtual networks pointing to a domain controller, Active Directory integrated DNS. What happens if you have a availability zone outage, a regional outage? How does DNS sort of work in that scenario, and ensuring its capability to do what it needs to do to align to your business requirements and SLAs, and private DNS zones even you could consider in that same topic as well.
You've just mentioned something very key there, DNS. It's always, as we all know, it's always DNS, right? We can all agree that, we're all on the call, we can agree it's always DNS's fault. But that just shows another integration between identity and the networking, because the availability of DNS is, again, vital to AVD. So again, it's a complex topic, is HA. I know we're talking about individual aspects of it, but the amount of sort of interaction, integration, a lot of these separate identity, networking, storage, and as Lourens mentioned, you have to look at it from a holistic kind of high level and how they all interconnect, because there's not one that's more important than the other. They all have a massive bearing on HA, especially for AVD. And again, it very much depends where if you're in a hybrid environment, then networking becomes even more important because of, as Andy mentioned, you've got the express routes and things like that. And again, with the networking, there is a sort of Microsoft. We go back to that shared responsibility. There is the aspect of, a lot of the backend services and connectivity to those, which go back to the sort of Microsoft responsibility. But what are those SLAs, and do they match with your corporate, kind of your company SLAs, and things like that? So let's move on now to talking about storage. Now, this is going to be a big one. I know when we were first talking about this, Lourens, we started talking deep, especially about FS Logics and really how complex this specific topic around storage can be. Because again, when it comes to user profiles and storage of data, this is very important, and how highly available your storage is. It's imperative for that user experience, and that user experience is vitally important with AVD. Microsoft generally tend to recommend using at least 2 separate storage accounts for a lot of VDI host pools when it comes to storage, and one's normally for the FS Logics profile container, and the one's for maybe if you're using sort of Office container data as well. Again, if you're using MSI App Attach as well, that's another thing you kind of use that second storage account for. Again, Lourens, I just want to quickly bring you in, as this is something, as I said, we've been discussing when we were planning this sort of panel discussion. Not only how important is it to get right, but also how complicated can it be? Because again, we almost went down a rabbit hole when we were discussing this, right?
For sure. Yeah, it does sort of tie back to it, that decision around identity, because if you're going to use FS Logics with profiles for the profile management, and you're going to provide HA across multiple regions, on the whole discussion then adds, or there's a whole complexity that gets added to that then. And identity plays into that. Because of the identity decision that you've made in the beginning, it has a consequence on how FS Logic and the storage will behave potentially. Now, if by default our recommendation is that when you deploy AVD is consider active passive as a start. But if there are scenarios that you do want to go active, then the storage conversation is then super important, because if you're going to go active, you need to have the storage available on both sides, in both regions. And then depending on whether you went dedicated personal pools or shared pools, the FS Logic conversation then becomes a bit more complicated. Because if you start introducing things like cloud cache and so on, that has got a very direct implication on the underlying storage architecture that you're going to need. So performance, identity, and all of those things are the things that you'll need to work through to get to what the ultimate configuration of best architecture for the customer is. And very importantly, what is the SLA that you actually are driving at for the customer? We know, speaking to customers, the customer will say to you, I want 5 nines. I want everything to be always up. Reality of that, though, that's got a significant consequence in what you will need to design for the customer.
100%. And again, Andy, you touched on it right at the start. Before we even get into any of these topics, it's about a business, an organization understanding what their business requirements are, their RPO, their RTO, their SLA, SLAs they need. Because again, we've mentioned it in every slide so far, right? If depending on what they are, will depend on the type of configuration you need to implement on these. Do you need something like Azure NetApp files? What's your FS Logics configuration going to be like? And Lourens just mentioned there around that connectivity to identity, because depending on how you authenticate to FS Logics, are you using the Kerberos authentication or using Entra? Again, that becomes less complicated. But if you're integrating with, Active Directory domain services, again, that can add a level of complication. So the architecture becomes very, very important. Again, Andy, just want to quickly bring you in and just obviously that sort of cubesys customer part is very fascinating. Some of the things we've done, so many of these deployments, right? What's the sort of things we've done at cubesys around the HA of storage and FS Logics? Are there any sort of key little tidbits you can give us around that?
Look, typically we don't do too many. We haven't done too many regional redundant deployments. I'll get to those in a second, though. But usually we land on like a in-region, highly available, leveraging availability zones deployments, and using Azure Files Premium zone redundant SKU, and obviously the compute's the same zone redundant in the host pools. That's typically what we land on. Sometimes we use NetApp files if there's a larger user base to handle the IOPS of the larger sort of user workload might warrant. But yeah, that's typically what we do. We don't usually there are situations where you'd separate the office profile and the main profile. We don't often do that. We have done it though on occasion if there's a requirement for it. And with the regional redundancy, it's interesting listening to Lourens speak about that and the SLAs and considering everything there. Like, especially if you get to the active and you want really, low RTOs and you want to sort of satisfy strict business requirements. I've been through that sort of thought process with a client, and you can go down you can just keep asking questions if you want and go down a rabbit hole, considering every single aspect. But sort of getting back to what I was alluding to, like the Microsoft AVD service is regionally redundant, and if there was an outage, it'd fail over in minutes and be back up and running, but there's no financially backed SLA behind that, so that was enough for them to say, okay, so we're not going to go down that active path. We're going to have separate host pools in the primary and DR region and separate that just because they weren't comfortable with that fact, and that's fine. I mean, they went to the nth degree, but that's fine. And Azure NetApp files is what we've used, just getting back to storage, when we've done multi-region deployments. There's some manual intervention there and failover, but we've got that down pat pretty well on the failovers, even though its manual's quite quick. So we have leveraged that on multiple occasions.
Thanks, Andy. You kind of touched on the sort of session host. There's a nice little segue into the next slide, so well done. It's almost like we planned this, right? It's weird. As I mentioned right at the start, IaaS is the IaaS cloud model is a central part of AVD, and compute is a key component of that. With AVD, you're looking at session hosts, as Andy mentioned, which is your virtual machines, but also, the golden image and the compute gallery as well, which you might not, again, with an AVD, from an AVD perspective, is vitally important, because if you can't provision any new VMs with your image, or you can't access that in a sort of HA scenario or a DR scenario, then that can be quite problematic. Andy, again, I wanted to just bring you in and see what your thoughts are around what do cubesys look at when it comes to working with customers and keeping these sort of compute services highly available. I know you touched on session hosts and things like that, but again, with that sort of golden image and compute gallery as well.
Yeah, so obviously, the session host, that's a pretty standard approach for a host pool deploying, spreading your sort of VMs across availability zones, as long as obviously the Azure region supports availability zones. The compute gallery, going to the bottom one there, the Azure compute gallery is a great sort of PaaS service for managing the versioning of your images, and we leverage that all the time. And it's also a way to replicate a copy of an image across to a secondary region if you chose to do so. Actually, with regional deployments, we've also deployed a separate compute gallery in the DR region, so we've got that complete separation of services between production and DR, and then we use some automation to make sure that the compute gallery in DR is kept up to date. And with the golden image itself, obviously you capture an image and put that version into the compute gallery. But if it's hosted on a machine, I think it's important we always back up that machine just with Azure Backup as well, in case you've got some data corruption or whatnot, just to make sure you can roll back in a worst case scenario. And we have used that actually in the past once or twice. So I think that's an important thing to do as well.
100%. The virtual machine ones, the virtual machine discussion is a lot easier to have because there are a lot more options around that. We're going to talk about sort of Azure services in a minute. But I think, again, understanding what your requirements are when it comes to your compute gallery. And again, how many images do you have as well? You might have multiple images that you need to have access to in sort of a HADR scenario. So again, it goes back to that holistic view that Lourens mentioned earlier, right at the start, and understanding what your requirements are around your architecture of your AVD. So the way I want to round this conversation off really is we've talked about individual aspects of AVD, but because AVD is very much a part of that Azure ecosystem and it integrates with obviously a lot of different Azure services, I thought I'd finish off the conversation by talking about some of those services. Now, there's multiple services we can talk about, right? There's availability zones, there's Azure Site Recovery, Azure Backup. And again, these all have their own place. There's not like one option. You more than likely can potentially use multiple options when it comes to you. So I want to kind of bring both Andy and Lourens in. I'll bring Lourens in first to talk about sort of the integration between these Azure HA services and how they fit into that AVD ecosystem. So yeah, just to you first, Lourens.
Certainly. So we think about availability zones here in Australia, that they are available in Australia East, and they are being expanded, and you would have probably see that as we introduce new regions like New Zealand North, that is becoming the sort of the de facto now that we go into market, that N+1 kind of model for an Azure region. Important part about availability zones is these are logical constructs. So don't see availability zones if there's three, like we mentioned in the documentation. It's not three data centers. These are three logical constructs that each one consists of multiple data centers typically, that would be separated through various geographical locations within the metropolitan area. So when you deploy that, obviously we split those workloads across those various data center artifacts, but they all are still within the same sort of latency envelope that we guarantee within an Azure region. Then now, as a site recovery is really, I think, where we sort of feel that if you look at it from a disaster recovery point of perspective from AVD, is really where you should start. Because if you're going to go multi-region, and unless you have that active single pool cloud cache environments, ASR is going to be your friend. If you've got personal pools, then ASR would be the one, because as a site recovery, will do the replication of that workload for you into a different region, and then you can do test failovers, and you can bring it online in the remote region. But that is also valid for shared pools as well, and that you could still use ASR to replicate a shared pool host across to a different region and instantiate that should something happen to the primary region.
See, for me with Azure Site Recovery, I've got my opinions changed over the years. When obviously cloud first kind of came in, people were still in that sort of, I'm going to call it on-premises mindset, and where they had on premises, they had a second location which they failed over to, etc. So it was a great service to sort of easily transition to sort of having a similar setup. But I feel like now the sort of high availability and redundancy services that Azure lets you have, we're talking about availability zones, availability sets, the different sorts of storage you can have, GRS, and all the sort of zone redundancy. I kind of feel like the services that Azure has are able to meet a lot of the RPO and RTO demands that clients have. They're not as demanding on that area. Yeah, there are still use cases for Azure Site Recovery. I'm sure there is. But I've my opinion of it has changed over as the more prominent clouds become. And Andy, I want to kind of bring you in to talk about that backup sort of discussion, because just because it's stored in cloud doesn't mean that it's backed up, right? There is obviously a level of higher availability and redundancy, but how important do we feel of backing up your storage, your VMs and stuff like that is when it comes to AVD specifically?
Yeah, well, with AVD, a standard multi-session host pool deployment, you're talking about non-persistent sort of machines. Probably the goal there is the user data, right? So their profile. Arguably, some companies don't even consider the user data, to be sacrosanct, and as day-to-day operation, they blow away user profile to do troubleshooting, for example. But yeah, backup's very, very important in certain situations. I'm just thinking to previous clients, in a cross-regional redundant sort of scenario where we had cross-regional restore enabled. That's one thing we have used for personal desktops to recover to a separate region. That customer did look at ASR, and not from memory, cost might have been a thing there as well, and they wanted to sort of drive costs down. So they went for backup, and they understood the time of the recovery time objective there. ASR offers far better recovery time and recovery point as well, but yeah, they went with backup in that regard. But yeah, for the multi-session host, you don't need to back up non-persistent machines, so we don't worry about that so much. Even dedicated, even personal desktops. There's some instances where if a user cohort doesn't have power access or administrative access to their own personal desktop, and it's just a vanilla desktop, you can almost treat that as a multi-session, but it's just a one-to-one mapping between user and desktop. We do that quite a lot and call that a pooled personal host pool. I know there's some customers of ours on the call that we've done that for. But yeah, if you've got a persistent personal desktop for a developer, for example, then you want to leverage Azure Backup for that.
And just talk about some of the sort of deployment options you have with AVD. When it comes to availability zones, really, you've got, you could have no availability zones. So your session host is then just kind of deployed in a single location within a region. When you do include availability zones, then your session hosts are sort of distributed across multiple availability zones, ensuring that if one zone experiences an outage, then those others can continue to operate. Now, this is going to minimize your downtime.
100%.
But I think yeah, and then you've got availability sets as well, which I've kind of not put on the slide. But while these aren't as resilient as availability zones, they do provide a way to distribute your VMs within a single data center. I think, as Lourens said, thinking of them as logical concepts rather than physical is probably, when you're architecting, is the way to go. And there are multiple benefits as well to these different services. Especially with the availability zone integration with AVD. Your cost, of course, you increase the availability, right? And they've got enhanced resiliency as well. And with sort of the Azure site recovery, this is very much a specific use case where you want to implement BCDR within your AVD environment. I personally can't remember any use cases where I've done that, if I'm honest, for AVD, because again, the sort of other services that we've talked about normally meet the RPO and RTO requirements and SLA requirements for customers. And Lauren, just quickly, when you've worked with customers on the sort of AVD deployments, is there any one sort of service you've found with AVD that they tend to integrate more with, availability zones, as your site recovery, as your back, what's your experience been?
It depends on the customer requirements. Availability zone is obviously tied to one region. As soon as the customer wants to go multi-region, then the conversation is, well, how will I have that second region? Is it going to be active or is it going to be passive? Now, yes, you can use certain Azure services to get storage data on the remote region, but when you're in an active scenario, you have to think about synchronization between those storage, and certain storage does not support that. So, for instance, our default for storage is as a false premium. As a false premium is bound to one region, it does not provide GRS storage for you. So you're going to have to figure out a mechanism to get the storage replicated on the other side, and that's why ASR really comes into play in those scenarios, because it does replication for you. Yeah. An option you would then consider if you don't want to use ASR and you want more active cloud cache, that's where ANF comes in. because ANF gives you that capability.
Mhm.
But then you do have the trade-off in terms of cost, because there's obviously cost that gets attached to that increased capability for that service. In terms of the customers, like I said, you start at most customers start at the active passive model and use ASR, and then work around that in terms of what is the actual requirements are that they have. Some just use dual pools, a pool in reason 1, a pool in reason 2. Anything happens, just reattach to pool number 2. It's as simple as that. We don't see a lot of customers that really have that high end, almost 4, 5 nines cloud cache kind of requirements.
Okay, it's interesting. One thing we've not actually mentioned once, I think I had it in a previous slide. A lot of these decisions are dictated by governance as well. You know, governance and compliance. I can't believe I've not mentioned that. And you know, if you have very tight regulations when it comes to compliance and the governance and where your data, the data sovereignty, I think they call it, you know, where does your data need to be? Can it be outside a region or outside a country? That's going to dictate a lot of this. Again, goes back to what you said at the start, right? Look at it from a holistic perspective. There's so many bits that can dictate these decisions. You need to look at them all under sort of a single pane, and then that will allow you to make decisions under which of these services you could really integrate with. But yeah, governance is a huge piece as well. So that's actually the last piece that we wanted to talk about. I just want to quickly highlight. I think Asta, thank you very much. You put the LinkedIn profiles for myself, Andy, and Lourens in there. So please feel free to connect with us. Got some customer case studies as well. The link there, and our cubesys LinkedIn. We do have another upcoming cubesys virtual event similar to this around building secure work environments with AVD smart desktops, which is on the 22nd of July, 2025. Again, same time. So the link to register is there. And we also have another event coming up called Transforming from Security Awareness to a Security Culture, a vital shift from SMB Healthcare, and that's on the 31st of July. Again, that's 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. similar time, and the registration link is in the chat as well. I don't think we have any questions, Asta, do we?
Actually, the floor is open for everyone. So please jot down your questions in the chat, or anything, or if Shabazz, you have any questions with Lourens and Andrew, then yeah, go ahead now.
I kind of asked all mine. I do want to take this time to thank both Lourens and Andrew for joining me. So thank you very much for taking the time out. Hopefully everybody has found it informative. If you think of a question later on, by all means, ping either myself or Andy or Lourens and connect with us on LinkedIn. But yeah, I think I covered all my questions I had throughout the conversation. We've covered a lot of ground. Yeah, that's pretty
Brilliant.
much it.
Wonderful. No, that we'll give each other our time back then. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks all.